My name is Matthew Facciani. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Notre Dame. I work in the computer science department there, and we study media literacy, and specifically media literacy in Southeast Asia. A lot of my work before coming to Notre Dame was looking at the United States and looking at misinformation and polarization in the United States. And there's a lot of misinformation research that focuses on more Western countries. So I was really excited at the opportunity to go beyond these Western countries that have this overemphasis and try to use the techniques that we've studied in these previous studies and apply them to different countries and different areas. It's still early on, working on our media literacy intervention. Basically, we developed this WhatsApp game that simulates kind of a WhatsApp conversation that you might have with some of your friends and family, that when they might be sharing misinformation. So if you're in this WhatsApp group and someone shares something that's incorrect or not based on science, how do you best respond to that? So our early findings is when people participate in this game, they are less likely to share false information after they participate in the game. So we do find that it does help reduce the intent to share false information afterwards. We work with a few different partners who are based in Indonesia that help with their translations, a few different organizations that work with collecting data in Indonesia specifically so they can make sure the translations make sense and they don't have any issues with it. As far as the WhatsApp being more artificial or not, it's actually interesting because our next study is to try to look at, right now it's a simulation of a WhatsApp environment, but we want to actually try to make it look much more authentic and actually be implemented within WhatsApp. So, and see if that makes a difference. If you're playing a game that looks like WhatsApp, does that have less of an effect if you are actually in WhatsApp yourself or something that looks a lot closer to WhatsApp? So that's next to see, because generally we have found that the closer the environment of the media literacy intervention is to the actual platform, the better it is. So we want to try to make it look as realistic as possible. We have implemented also a few different ways of trying to see how we can get this out in the wild with TikTok influencers, actually. So we have them promote our media literacy intervention, they share it on their TikTok channel, and then we see how many people engage with it. So some of our recent research has shown that up to about 40 million people has engaged with this media literacy intervention. So we're getting out in the wild, and we also do survey research to see if the people who are doing it, if it reduces their intent to share misinformation. So we're trying to do both angles of getting it out in real-world data and real-world environments versus also testing it in the laboratory and seeing if it actually is having an impact on beliefs. The name in Bahasan is Gali Fakta. It just basically means like dig into the facts or find the truth. And actually maybe double check me on that because I want to make sure that's the correct translation. So. But yeah, so we have a website. It's also Literata is the bigger project. We've worked with a few different organizations, like I said, in Indonesia to get this out into the communities and to make sure that it represents some of the most important issues in Indonesia that are vulnerable to misinformation.
My name's Piers Howe, and I'm an associate professor in the School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne. I am primarily a cognitive scientist, but I'm slowly moving into this area. I am a researcher. I have done a small project on fact-checking. So a lot of social media organizations are trying to confront the misinformation flowing on their platforms using fact-checking. So they're wising up that their users are dissatisfied by the amount of misinformation and they need to do something. And they mostly have various forms of fact-checking solutions. And I asked in this project with my students, suppose they're successful, suppose they were to create the perfect fact checker, whatever that would mean, suspend disbelief for a moment. Suppose they had an automated fact checker, because there's too much content for a human to fact check, an automated fact checker which was instantaneous, 100% accurate, unbiased, you name it. Suppose they got that. How useful would it be? To what degree would it actually reduce the flow of misinformation on their platform? To to what degree would people actually use it and not just turn it off? And if they did use it, to what degree would it actually affect their decisions? For example, if a post was labeled as false, would that mean that they wouldn't share it? So we've done a whole bunch of studies. We've interviewed people to ask them what they would do, and then we ran a bunch of studies where we had a simulated social media environment, which looks a bit like Facebook, and people would share and talk to each other on this simulated environment, and would see what they would share, and then we would introduce fact-checking and see if they would turn it off and see if they would actually use it. And we found that they would often turn it off, and this wasn't because they distrusted it, and it wasn't because there was some advantage to turning it off. They just were more focused on sharing, and they didn't want to be bothered by whether the stuff they were sharing was true or not. We're in the process of trying to scale it up into more realistic environments where they would have their friends. Obviously, there's ethical issues about going onto real environments, so this is always how realistic can you make it, but yes, that would be the next step. I would have thought, though, they would be more likely to share false information when there is more pressure on them to share posts. So if they were going to be honest, I would imagine they'd be more likely to be completely honest in a simulated environment where there's actually nothing at stake. If they don't share these posts, if they don't gain more followers, it's not going to hurt them socially. No one's going to know. The experiment ends. There's no consequence. And yet, even when there really was no real benefit for them sharing false stuff, and when there was actually a detriment in that it took time to turn off the fact checker, they would turn it off. And when posts were labeled as false, they would still share them. No, but I think it's disappointing, but I think your question's a really good one. It's like, it was, and when we did this, before we even ran them, we asked them, what would you do? And they actually told us their behavior. They'd say, yes, I would often turn off the fact checker, and I would often share false posts, and I think everyone's going to do the same. So these are social media posts that were actually used and then fact-checked by various agencies, for example, Snoops, and we would just take the post, put it there, and say, if this was to come into your feed, would you fact check it? Would you share it? Except, yeah, that was the initial bit, and then we actually had a system where they were receiving posts in a simulated feed, and they actually had to indicate whether they would share it and go through the clicks. I would imagine that the question's a good one. I would imagine, though, people are more likely to say that they would be honest if you ask them. They'll be more likely to say they'll be honest than they would actually be honest if you put them to the test. So the fact that they're not even saying they will be honest and they're not acting honest in a simulated environment does not bode well. Well, the purpose of this research was more to say, okay, hold on, social media companies. This is the solution that most of you are pushing, and you're trying to persuade us this is going to solve the problem and just give you more time to develop a better fact-checking solution. That's not going to be enough. So it's a bit of a warning that there needs to be more, and actually they need to be more heavily regulated.